All right, everybody, welcome to In the Spread. My name is Nick Kefalides, and today's episode we're going to be targeting fall time bass. We're going to use a variety of different methods, fishing anywhere from shallow water to offshore structure to suspended bass. And I'm going to show you an array of different techniques to do so, and hopefully we'll get you some results similar to these. So stay tuned, and I hope you guys get to learn quite a bit and ultimately get you a bag of fish like this. That's what it's all about right there. All right, so we're out here. It's late October to early November time frame, and we're fishing a little bit smaller body of water than what I typically tend to fish. But this is usually my favorite kind of fishing. We're based in an old mine pit down here in Florida, and it's just something that was like most mine pits. It's been here for long time, and not your traditional Florida lake per se. A lot of times, on average, your lakes in Florida, you're fishing anywhere from 2 to 4 foot of water. For the most part, there's deeper parts, but a lot of times, that's just the nature of Florida lakes, is shallow water fishing. So anytime I get a chance to fish a body of water that's a little bit deeper, where I can, get on my graphs and really see what kind of structures on the bottom, I really enjoy that. Dialing in what the fish are doing, seeing where they're at in the water column and what kind of structure they're relating to. So that's what we're doing here today. It's fall time, so these fish are traditionally, or historically speaking, in the fall, these fish are offshore, chasing bait, eating, schooling, and in a lot of cases they're suspending. There's suspending bass is probably one of the hardest bass to catch, just because they're so unpredictable. A lot of times they're not active. Now, if they're schooling and they're feeding, that's one thing, but if they're just suspended in the middle of the water column, there's usually 3 different reasons that they're suspended, and we're going to cover those 3 reasons today. How to determine which one of the 3 reasons it is, and how to catch those fish. So that's what we'll be doing out here today. Covering all that, going over different techniques and considerations for suspending fish. So stay tuned, and about to catch some fish. So the way I normally fish, I've said this before, and I'll always pretty much stick to this. Regardless of what body of water you're fishing, what time of year it is, doesn't matter. You want to allow the fish to tell you what they're doing, okay? So don't, when you're going out, try to stay open-minded. Don't go out telling yourself, okay, there's a specific bait I'm gonna use, there's a specific technique. You're gonna have an idea in terms of, am I going to be cranking? Am I going to be flipping and pitching in shallow water? You're going to know that, but try to keep an open mind, because the fish aren't always going to be doing what you predict they're going to be doing prior to getting out on the water. So that's what we're doing. We're just out here trying to target these fish. We're seeing what they're doing, and we're going to let them talk to us and let us know what they want to eat. So start out trying to cover some water. Right now we're at about 35 feet of water. I've got some offshore structure here, some nice rocks, some humps and deviation in the bottom. So we're going to be starting off throwing a Carolina rig and just dragging the bottom along those rocks. You know, trying to entice a strike from these fish that are sitting closer to the bottom. Right now, there seems to be some suspended fish, so I'm going to see, you know, what this Carolina rig's going to do, if anything at all, and we'll go from there. As you can see, you've got fish, clear that off, you know, suspended this middle line here. See them kind of going up? These fish are all suspended, different sizes and whatnot, but that tells me that right now the Thermocline is set in. And I'll try to explain kind of what the Thermocline is in layman's terms. You know, it's one of those things, you ask 100 different people, you'll get 100 different answers, but I'll do the best I can to explain this. Thermocline is basically when a body of water stratifies. So when you get your less dense, your warmer water, less dense water is going to rise to the surface, and your more dense water, which is your cooler water, is obviously going to be towards the bottom. Well, there's a layer that's in between those two, and that layer is referred to as the Thermocline. And basically the reason for that is depletion of oxygen in that lake. So you'll have three reasons that bass are suspended. Either one, it's oxygen, two, it's temperature, or three, it's bait. So if we're going along here and we're seeing big pods of bait and there's bass underneath of them, then yeah, obviously we're gonna know that they're chasing bait. Here today, based off of what I'm seeing on my graphs, there's a Thermocline. Traditionally speaking, the Thermocline usually in the hotter season, so August, September, sometimes even to October, depending on how warm it stays, you'll have that Thermocline, and you'll be able to see it on some of these, you know, higher grade electronics. You can actually see a distinct line in the water column, and you'll see where the fish are hanging out just above that Thermocline. And the reason for that is because these fish are instinctual. They do what they need to do in order to survive. So because of that depletion of the oxygen levels and the pH levels towards the bottom, they'll hang out just above that Thermocline. And that's what we're trying to figure out here, is if they're doing that. You know, if you have a distinct Thermocline, you noticed consistently those fish are hanging out just above that line, you almost want to treat that line as your new bottom. You don't want to be fishing down deep. You want to try to fish suspending baits, you know, crankbaits that are running in the middle of that water column. I know normally you want to be fishing crankbaits where you're making contact with the bottom, but in this particular instance, changes the game a little bit. You want to treat that Thermocline as your new bottom. You could fish jerk baits, you can fish jigging spoons or flutter spoons. So you know, there's a handful of different baits that you can use, but a lot of bass anglers do not like fishing for suspended bass simply because it's intimidating. You know, it's very difficult to catch them if you don't know what you're doing or know what you're looking for. You know, this isn't your traditional. There, you know, we kind of get ingrained in our heads to cast to structure that you can see. You know, I'm casting to lily pads, or I'm casting to, you know, some brush piles or some cattails or something like that, and that you don't really, you know, have in this scenario. You're fishing offshore structure that you can't really see. So, you know, between it being a tougher bite, you know, it can be very intimidating. So, but once you get them dialed in, you figure them out, it can be really fun and it can be very productive. So that's what we're going to be doing here. I've caught some pretty big fish out of this body of water. I know that they're in here. It's just a matter of, you know, seeing if they want to, I thought I had a little bite there. You know, just seeing if they want to cooperate. Seth, if you can just show them up top here, one of the obstacles that we're working with today, or challenges I should say, is full moon. So anytime you're dealing with a full moon type situation and there's not much cloud cover, that moon's been bright all night long, and those fish have been feeding. If you don't have any cloud cover to kind of dim that brightness a little bit, these fish have been feeding all night long. So sometimes you can still catch them or trigger them into a reaction bite, but sometimes when they get in that state where they are just lockjaw, it can be extremely frustrating trying to catch them. So in my experience, a lot of times when you have that full moon scenario going, it's usually a later bite, because these fish have to feed. They're going to feed about every 3 to 4 hours. But if they've been feeding all night, sometimes they'll go 5 or 6 hours because they've completely gorged themselves. And I've noticed in that scenario, I won't catch anything all morning. I'm like, what are these fish doing? I might catch 1 or 2 here or there, and then like a light switch, they come on. But it's usually like a later, a noon, 1 o'clock type bite before you start catching them. We'll try a couple different things this morning. Like I said, we're just trying to figure out what these fish are doing. Right now I'm going to be throwing a DD22 made by Spro. It's a Fat John, and these are really good crankbaits out of the box. They don't really require any tuning or anything like that. So that one dives about 16 to 20 feet, and we'll see if they're wanting more of a moving style bait. A lot of times when you're fishing offshore structure like this, you're trying to figure out, you're trying to see what level the water column these fish are holding at, and from there you determine, okay, this is the style of bait I need to fish, or this is the depth I need to be fishing at. And something I always try to take into consideration is if possible, you want to try to fish above the fish. So if they're suspended in the middle of the water column, you want to try to fish something that's above them. Not that they won't go down to get it, because they will, especially if they're feeding. They'll definitely go and get it, but you have to think about where these fish's eyes are positioned. They're, for these bass and for most fish, some fish, their eyes are more so on the side of their head than they are on the top of their head. But for bass, for the most part, their eyes are on the top of their head. So in most cases, they're looking up, and that's just, I think you're going to have more of a chance of catching these fish if you're above them when they're suspended, as opposed to below them. Even more so when we're talking, up north, if you're fishing for, spotted bass or smallmouth bass, their eyes are even closer together. So in most cases, you're wanting to keep that bait above where they're sitting in that water column. When you're fishing offshore structure, if you're marking on your graphs, or even if you're fishing from the bank and you just know that there's something, off the bottom that fish are relating to, you might cast to it, 10, 15 times and not even get a bite. But sometimes it could be something as simple as, it could be something as simple as just changing your angle. So maybe repositioning the boat and casting from a different angle might be all it takes. And so you want to do that if you've got a really distinct piece of structure on the bottom, or a hump or something that fish are holding to. They might just be stubborn. You might just need to change the angle. You might just need to downsize the bait. It could be a number of things. So don't give up. If those fish are there, then do what it takes to catch them. Yeah, if if somebody's going to ask me, you know, I've had people ask me before, you know, what's the best time of day to fish? And it's, you know, it's kind of a hard question to answer just because there's so many different variables that play into that. You know, like if I was given a 2-hour window on today, let's say, I'm given 2 hours that I feel that I'd be most likely to catch fish, I would look at multiple different things. I'm obviously looking at the body of water that we're fishing, the time of year, the depth of that body of water, and then I'm looking at the lunar table as well. So if we look at all the different variables that play into today, you know, we're in a full moon situation. We're in a deep body of water. Some parts of this lake get down to about 60 feet. You know, I'm going to say your bite's not going to be early in the morning. And now that kind of goes against everything that, you know, most bass fishermen, you know, would think, because usually you're like, oh, I'm going to get out first thing in the morning, I'm going to get on that top water bite, or, you know, that's when they're most active and they're feeding. Well, in a lot of cases it is, but in these situations, my experience fishing these deeper water lakes, it's not a first thing in the morning type bite. It's usually a later bite, and even more so, I think, because of the moon, like I was mentioning before, you know, those fish have been feeding all night long. So, you know, you figure before that sun came up, you know, they're still feeding. You want to give them a few hours. So if I were to answer that question, I would recommend, you know, I would say look at all the different variables. You know, look at what time of year it is. Obviously, you know, the air temperature, the water temperature, you know, the body of water in terms of the structure you're fishing and the depth of water you're fishing, and then obviously the lunar table, because I can't remember a time that I've fished on a full moon situation where we just slayed them, you know, first thing in the morning. Unless you're out there before that sun breaks and you're catching the tail end of that you know, feed phase, the full moon, middle of the night, you know, where they're gorging themselves, then it's usually a later bite, in my opinion. So that's what I would suggest to anglers trying to pinpoint, you know, that you might not have a whole day to fish, or even a half a day to fish. You might only have, you know, a couple hours, or, you know, an hour even. I'm gonna just try something real quick, because we basically got fish that are, I'm looking at my down imaging, and they seem to be bunched up in the middle of the, excuse me, these fish seem to be bunched up in the middle of the water column right here behind the boat. I couldn't tell if they're on bait, but I mean, there's nothing there. They're just stacked up, and they look to be bass. Let's see. What I've got here is what we call a flutter spoon. And I'm basically just jigging it in the middle of the water column. Trying to get these fish to react to it. This is just a traditional 5.5 inch flutter spoon by Nichols Lures, and I'm basically just, you don't even have to cast it out that far. If you locate a school of fish, or you see them congregated on a, you know, on a hump or something like that, you can drop this down and just you're imitating a, you know, a bait fish that has been injured, and you're just trying to put that spoon right in the middle of that school. %90 of the time when you're fishing this flutter spoon or jigging spoon, whatever you prefer to call it, they're going to hit it on the fall. So what you want to do is, you know, watch your line as it's sinking, because this spoon is, that's why it's called a fluttering spoon. It's basically fluttering to the bottom, and a lot of times as it's falling, that those fish will hit it. So you want to watch your line, you know, follow it down, and usually you'll see that line twitch or jerk, and you don't need a super monstrous hook set. You know, basically, you see how I'm jigging it. A lot of times, if they have it and you pull up on the rod tip like this, it'll hook them. The biggest thing when fishing suspended bass is figuring out what they're doing. Why are they suspended? That's usually the biggest obstacle. Once you can determine why they're suspended, then you can narrow it down to what they're going to eat. Whether it's a feeding type, bite, or, you know, whether they're just doing it out of pure reaction. All right, so we're going to move, you know, further down this bank line. I was on the graphs as we were moving along here earlier, and I noticed some fish schooled up, but they're not eating right now. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to keep moving down the bank line and try to pinpoint what these fish are doing. We'll come back to this area here in a little while and see if they're going to be feeding at that point. Right now, though, I've tried a few different techniques, and you know, I have not narrowed anything down yet, so I don't want to sit on the same area for too long. I want to try to cover as much water as possible, and you know, continue to dissect the body of water and obviously the conditions, and just try to see what these fish are doing. So this is a lipless crankbait, more or less. A lot of people refer to it as a rattle trap, just because I think rattle trap's probably the oldest manufacturer that pretty much came up with the original lipless crankbait design. But yeah, this one's made by Strike King, and I've caught some good fish on this one. It's just a red eye shad. You get this cast in, and I'll show you exactly what we're working with here. This is basically mimics a shad to a T. It's got a little bit of chrome on the bottom with that bronze in the middle, and then that kind of bluish purplish back. This is actually a 1/2 ounce. It's a little bit smaller bait. So I've caught them in here on 1/2 ounce. I've also caught them on 3/4 ounce, a little bit bigger, something that gets down a little bit deeper. So we're gonna see what they're doing, see if they'll eat this, because this size bait mimics primarily the size of the bait that's in this body of water. Cover a lot of water, makes noise, there's rattles in it. And right now we're just doing a steady retrieve, you know, just kind of medium pace. And you can change the cadence. You know, like I said, you want to let the fish talk to you. So, you know, sometimes if there's grass along the bottom, you kind of want to be burning that bait through that grass. Other times the fish want it slow. Sometimes they want a little bit of a stop and go tight retrieve, you know, or you'll pause it, and as soon as you stop it or as soon as you twitch it, they'll hammer it. It just depends on what they're doing. So you want to try to build some kind of pattern. You want to develop that pattern, and every time you get a bite, you want to think to yourself, okay, what was I doing when that fish hit? You know, when that fish bit that bait, you know, was I on a steady retrieve? Was I ripping it through hydrilla? Was I slow rolling it? Was I doing a, you know, stop and go type retrieval? And if it happens more than once, then you want to start trying to dial in that pattern and say, okay, well, I think this is what they're doing right now. This is why they're eating it. But we definitely have a situation where these fish are suspended here. If you take a look down right here, you can see, you know, these fish are all in the middle of the water column. We're at about 40 feet of water and they're at about 20 feet. So this is a textbook, you know, you know, suspending bass situation in early fall time of the year. And man, they can be tough to catch, but if you figure them out, it's game on. It can be lights out. Right now that was a bite. Right now I want you to look at something real quick. So look at what we're coming up on. I've got my fish ID turned on. Look at all these fish. So you got 40 feet of water right here. This is 20 feet. Look at how these fish are just hanging in the middle. And you've got a bunch of them stacked. Now those might be crappie and whatnot, but these are bass up here. And that's what we're trying to catch right there. But right now we're trying to cover as much water as possible, being that we're not honed in on anything. We haven't developed any kind of pattern, and we haven't really figured out what these fish are doing. So right now I'm just trying to cover water and just get something going to try and determine, you know, what we need to be doing. Or we need to be doing a finesse style fishing? Do we need to be fishing moving baits, crankbaits, things of that nature? Now I've already went over this area with my graphs, so I know that there's some big lay down trees right out in front of where we're at. They push off about 50 feet and they're pretty much scattered. They're all over and there's fish on them. Whether or not they'll bite, we're gonna find out, but I'm basically fishing the bottom right now with this heavier structure jig, and I'm looking for that structure. I want to bump that structure. That's how I know I'm in the right spot. And right now I'm just kind of bouncing it off the bottom. And a lot of times when you find that structure, if you bump this jig off that structure, you feel yourself coming over a tree limb, you lift that rod tip, it'll come over that tree limb, and in most cases they'll hit it right then and there. In this case, I'm making long casts. I'm trying to cover a lot of water, And I'm just taking my time. This is not a bait that you want to work fast. It's not something you want to try to hurry up and get back to the boat. Sometimes, I mean, these fish at times can get so stubborn, especially when you're in this phase of the lunar table where you've got that full moon. You know, sometimes I've had a bait sit for upwards of a minute, you know, before these fish will eat it. You have to fish so slow sometimes to get them to eat because they're just so lethargic. And sometimes, you know, when you think you're fishing slow, fish it even slower. You know, that's just kind of the, see, there's, feel the tree limb there. Basically what I want to do is I want to lift my rod tip. There it is. Now I want to make sure I don't get caught on it. So I just came over it, and now I'm going to let it fall back into the trees. I'm watching my line because I can see it sinking. Jig it a couple times in that tree. And it can be tricky. It can be tricky when you're right in the middle of trees. Let's see. Not to get hung up. That's why you want to fish something that's weedless. For the most part, you know, the jigs, when you've got that weed guard on there, it'll prevent most hang-ups, but not all hang-ups. So that's why you got to try to determine what's a bite and what's a tree limb that you're coming over. Because if you set the hook and you bury that hook in that tree, chances are you just lost your lure. You just lost that jig. So make sure you've got a bite. And then other times you can't even really prevent, you know, getting hung up. Like right now, I've caught on that tree limb and I'm trying to pop it off, but you know, these trees are so thick down there. A lot of times the only way to get that lure to come off is to drive over top of it, get on the other side of it, and then try to pull your lure. So that's what we're going to do here. And again, we're in about 30 foot of water, so you know, this spot should be good. These fish shouldn't be that easily spooked. Being now, if we were in 10 foot of water and I had to come over here and do this, the chances are we would spook them. See, and now we got to the other side of that tree and was able to come break it free. But you can see these trees here, and you can see all the fish that are stacked on them. I mean, there's some big ones down there. You know, there's some trees down along the bottom there. But again, in the middle of the water column. So we'll push back out and we'll try this bottom approach again. I'm going to be jumping back and forth here between that structure jig and that wobble head with that trick worm that I was using. And we're basically just trying to figure out whether these fish are wanting a bigger or smaller profile bait. A lot of times when they're stubborn like this, you just want to downsize. A lot of times downsizing can be the difference between catching them and not catching them. When I'm fishing this wobble head, it's not really a jigging style motion, if you will. Basically what I'm doing is I'm dragging this bait to the side and I'm feeling for structure. If I'm raising that rod tip, I'm basically coming over top of this, you know, I'm hopping it over top of the structure of the rocks, whatever's down there. So I'm not going to feel everything. I've got this 3/4 ounce wobble head, so it's down on the bottom, and I'm basically just dragging about 6 to 8 inches at a time, and I'm feeling for structure down there. A lot of times when you feel the rocks, you feel that the head of that weight, you know, bumping against those rocks or hitting against trees, that's in most cases, 90% of the time, that's when you're going to get your bites. Now, if you feel like you're getting hung up, you know, if you're dragging that and all of a sudden it's like getting stuck, or you've come across a brush pile or a lay down tree and you feel like you're dragging to the side and it's about to get hung up, raise your rod tip. That's the point where you're like, okay, I don't want to get hung up. I want to keep my bait in the strike zone. Let me raise my rod tip, try to get the bait to come over top of that rock pile, you know, or that tree pile without getting wedged in there and getting hung up. See, like right now, I can feel, and there's trees all the way out here. So I felt like I was getting hung up by dragging it to the side, so all I did was kind of raise my rod tip a little bit, got that bait to come over top of those trees, and then I can continue on with what I'm doing. In most cases, when you do that, like I was saying before, that's when you're going to get your strike. This is where you'll catch some big fish lurking down in the depths. We don't have too much of a wind yet. It's just starting to kick up. It's only 8:30 and I got about a 7 to 8 mile an hour wind. It should pick up to probably 15 by this afternoon. But you want a little bit of wind. You don't want it to be dead calm. But when you are fishing in the wind, you want to try to face into it. I know it's a lot harder to cast when you're facing into the wind. You know, you tend to get more backlashes and whatnot, so it can be frustrating at times, especially if you've got a, you know, really heavy wind. And in most cases, when you do, you know, sometimes you can't cast into the wind. It's just impossible. But when allowed, when able to, you want to try to cast into the wind, because if these fish are ambushing bait, if there's water that's moving, if there's any kind of current or anything like that, naturally those fish will face upwind or up current. And that's because that forage or that bait is moving naturally with the current, and those fish are sitting in little pockets or, you know, in rock piles or brush piles or anything that they can use as an ambush point to pick off that bait as it's coming by. So you want this bait to look as natural as possible. If you've got all the bait, you know, there's strong current and you've got all the baits flowing one way and your worm's coming the other way, it's not to say that they're not going to eat that bait, because if they're eating and they're in a frenzy, they're probably going to eat it regardless. But, you know, if you're not in that frenzy situation and you're on a tougher bite, you're trying to make the most natural presentation possible. So go with the flow. I know everybody's heard that saying before. Well, it applies when fishing any kind of body of water that's got, you know, moving water or current or anything like that, and there's a lot of bait that's being pushed into a specific area. Those fish will set up ambush points, you know, especially if they're lethargic and they're not trying to chase bait. They're looking for that opportunistic kind of, you know, that opportunity to where they're sitting in a spot and all they got to do is come up and grab a bait as it's flowing by their little hideout or wherever they're at in the cover. And as you can see, it's about 8:45 in the morning here, and we still got the moon high in the sky. That's never really a good sign in terms of fishing. So we're going to prove the lunar gods wrong. There we go. Haha. So that was a better fish, but kind of going back and forth here. different crankbaits. One's about a 15-foot diver and the other one's about a 25, and just trying to see if there's a specific particular range that they're wanting the bait at. There's one. Oh, he missed it. Well, that's good. Typically, when you've got suspended fish or schooling fish, you know, a lot of times getting that initial bite can be challenging. But a lot of times, once you get that initial bite, you get them fired up, and that's what you want. And it can get good when that happens. I've had times where, you know, you'll catch that first one. It may have took you an hour, but then all of a sudden, every cast after that, you know, you're just getting hammered. And sometimes they just light up like that when one gets caught, and the rest of them get all fired up. Not really sure what it is or what causes it, but we'll take it. Hopefully that happens to us today. When you're fishing a crankbait, like we're doing right now, you know, there's a lot of different things you want to take into consideration. You know, fall time can be really good for cranking. You know, I never throw braid on my reels, on my cranking reels and rods. You know, when you're considering, you know, the rod type and whatnot, you want something that's not, you know, it's got a super soft tip. You don't want something with a really stiff tip on it. You want something that's got a nice parabolic bend to it. You want there to be some stretch, you know, and that's the whole point. I'll use fluorocarbon line. Usually the pound test will be determined by, you know, what size crankbait I'm throwing. But you know, it can be very productive if done correctly. Like for something like this, you know, I've got about a 16-foot diving crankbait on here. You know, a lower gear ratio. You know, you're not trying to. There's a misconception where, oh, I need a, you know, if I use a higher gear ratio, like a 7-to-3 or 8-to-1 gear ratio on a crankbait, then it's less cranking. I don't have to crank as fast and it'll move. But the problem is you lose a lot of torque when you do that. You know, you don't need a super fast gear ratio. You want something that's a lower speed. It's got more torque. It's not gonna, you know, make you overwork. So by the end of the day, you feel like you know, you were working out, you know, forearms for 3 hours. Something that a lot of people don't think about is, you know, for like a lot of northern guys, you know, when you're fishing up north and it's cold, those fish's mouths get a lot harder. So it's a little bit more difficult for those hooks to penetrate their mouths with that colder water temperature because they're so hard. Down here in Florida, we get a lot of what we call, you know, mush mouth, or, you know, that basically where their mouths are, you know, just super soft. So those hooks don't really have, you know, a hard time, you know, penetrating their mouth. But on the flip side of that, that's why you want something that, you know, that the line's got some stretch to it, the rod's got some flex in it, because you don't want to rip a hole in that fish's mouth. If he's got a, you know, you're in warmer water temperature, and they've got that mush mouth per se, you know, you don't want to rip a hole in that fish's mouth, create these, you know, big holes, because as soon as he jumps, he's going to throw that hook, and that's pretty much counterproductive. So just something you want to take into consideration when you're, you know, throwing throwing a crankbait any time of year really. Another thing is the lighter line, the deeper your bait's going to go. So if you've got a thinner diameter line, say a 12-pound test fluorocarbon, you know, on a bait that says it's going to dive 10 feet, well, if you try to throw that same 10-foot diving bait on, say, 15 to 17-pound fluorocarbon, it's not going to dive as deep because of the diameter. So if you're trying to reach a specific depth or a piece of structure at a specific depth, that's something you want to think about. You know, if you're like, man, I got this 15-foot diving crankbait, this rocks at 14 to 15 feet, but I can't feel the bottom. It's probably because you've got too heavy a line on there. Other thing, when you're fishing deep diving crankbaits or big crankbaits, you want to make sure that you're using the right gear for the application. Like I've got this Spro crankbait right here. It dives to 25 plus feet. It's a giant bait, but it gets down there, and you want a super long, like this is an 8-foot rod, something that'll allow you to get those super long casts to really bomb that bait out there. Because if you've got a bait that dives down to 25 feet, it's going to take a minute for it to get down there. So you need those long casts to give it time to get to the depth that it's designed to be fished at, but also, you want to have that bait stay in that strike zone for a decent amount of time, enough time for a fish to be able to see it and chase it and strike it. If you're only fishing this type of bait on a 7 or 7.5 foot rod, you're not getting that bait out far enough. You're kind of defeating the purpose, because by the time you get that bait down to the desired depth, you're almost at the boat. So really, in essence, you're not in the strike zone for much time at all, which in turn is gonna reduce your chances of getting that bite. So you want to, at the end of the day, you want to try to keep that bait in that desired depth in that strike zone for as long as possible. So I'll bomb this thing out there, as far as I can, trying to keep it where it needs to be. And I'm making contact with the bottom right now, which is good. It's what you want. Notice over here it's only 20 foot. Over there it's a lot deeper. Back in this little cove over here, it actually gets pretty shallow in some spots. So that's why I figured we'll come over here and fish some of this. There we go. Oh, it came off. I don't think I had that one hooked very good. But Florida can be tricky. This part of the country is where you'll find bass spawning the longest. They spawn in some areas of Florida. They'll spawn for 6 months out of the year, which is just insane. They'll do it in waves, and I've seen them spawn, or start to spawn anyways, as early as November and as late as June, which is just, it's crazy. But we're noticing a lot of fish offshore that were suspended right in the middle of the water column. And I haven't been out to this body of water in quite some time, and I didn't have a chance to get out here at all prior to today. So I'm pretty much just trying to dissect where these fish are at, what they're doing. And they could be, we've had a couple cold fronts now for Florida. It's funny to even say the word you know, cold front, but we've had a couple, and usually that's all it takes. A couple full moons, some cold fronts, and these fish will start getting into your pre-spawn mode, where they'll start moving from that offshore structure and, you know, chasing bait up into these shallower waters, where they'll you know, they'll start getting ready to do their thing. Usually this early in the year, it's the bucks, it's the males are starting to get on the beds and prep, and then usually shortly thereafter is where you'll get, you know, your females will start moving up as well. But get up here and fish some of this shallower water. It's got some grass coming off the bottom, some hydrilla and whatnot, and so we'll try that and just see if maybe they're a little bit more congregated, or, you know, willing to feed in that area, in the shallower water, as opposed to that offshore stuff. She ate that rattle trap, literally right off the bank. We've been targeting these deeper fish, and you know, we weren't having any luck, so I said, you know, let me go ahead and get a little shallower with this rattle trap, and sure enough, she ate it right off the bank. He hammered it. He's not big, but he thinks he is. That fish absolutely hammered it. If I would have had to guess the weight of this fish just based off of the strike, this is not what I would have had in mind. But clearly he was hungry. But yeah, so I'm trying a mixture of different things right here. I've tried casting from kind of off the bank to the bank and bringing it along. I'll try that, and then now I'll try doing something where I'm kind of running parallel to the bank, and you know, I'll just retrieve it kind of parallel. I'll find, you know, how far out I want to be based off of the depth of what I'm using and how deep it dives. Like this rattle trap's usually in the 5 to 7 foot range, depending on how much, you know, how heavy rattle trap you're using or how much you let it sink. We've got some, it's kind of hard to see here, but we've got a little bit of hydrilla coming off the bottom, which can be very, very good. The bass, usually anywhere on any body of water, anywhere you go, typically relate to hydrilla. And ripping this crankbait right over top of it can just be deadly. It can be really good when the bite is hot. A lot of times you'll feel it kind of hang up in that hydrilla, and once you rip it through that blade of grass, 90% of the time is when they'll hammer it. So the two fish we've caught so far have been smaller ones, closer to the bank, but that doesn't mean there's not bigger ones with them. See the fish with them? See the fish with them? It's a bigger fish with them. See them? There's a fish just underneath that fish, bigger one, probably about 4 pounds. And I've seen that in this lake. I've seen that in this lake several times, where these fish will be together. Usually where there's one, there'll be another. That's pretty cool to see that. I've had it before. I've caught one, and again, not a giant, but just a pretty little fish. I've caught them in here where I've got them to the boat, and there must have been 6 or 7 with them that were all over 5 pounds. You know, this area over here, water tends to get a little shallower And there's some nice hydrilla growing off the bottom. You can see it all here. It's not super thick, it's not topped out, it's just kind of random clumps and scattered, and that's perfect for any kind of shallow water crankbait or lipless crankbait. And then obviously on the shore here you've got a mixture of kind of rocks and whatnot. And so far this morning, the only real pattern we've been able to develop was some of these fish being up in this shallower water. So you'll see sometimes it'll look like I'm, you know, hung up or I've got a fish on, and really it's trying to rip it through this grass here. So like we talked about before, you're always looking for things that stick out to you. Okay, what was I doing when I caught that last fish? Where was I? Where was the fish? What kind of cover was around it? What kind of structure was I on? What was the depth? You know, and you can also keep a log too. If you fish a particular body of water on a regular basis, you can keep a log on the times that you tend to catch more fish during that time of year. For me personally, you know, on this body of water, like I mentioned earlier, it's never really been an early morning bite. You know, it's always been, you know, a little later once the sun comes up. You know, water temperature warms up just a tad bit, is when the fish seem to be a little bit more active here. So it's just something you want to, you know, always be, you know, cognizant of and thinking about, trying to develop that pattern. Because if you're taking a mental note of all these different things and you develop that pattern, well, you may have just narrowed down exactly what the fish are doing, what they want, and you can tailor your game plan to that. And at the end, ultimately, you know, you could have a really good day, or if you're fishing, you know, a tournament or something like that, you can win some money, whatever you're trying to accomplish. When you get in a situation where you've got bass that are suspended and they're just not really feeding, they're kind of being stubborn, they got that lockjaw going on, this is a bait that I've found to be good in those types of situations when it's just hard to get a bite and you know, they're just looking for a really slow presentation. And this is something that it's not a secret by any means. It's just a basic wacky rig is what it's called. Wacky rig with a Senko worm. So this is a 6-inch Fat Ace Senko made by Gambler Worms, and I've got it paired up with a VMC weedless wacky hook. You can see the little weedless guard on there. And the way I rig this, if you see, I've got a little O-ring that's right here, about the middle of that wacky worm. And what it does is it retains that hook. You know, I notice a lot of times if you try to run this hook, you know, through the middle of the bait, by the time you cast it 5 or 6 times, you've already kind of wore a hole in that bait, and it ends up flying off your hook anyway. So what we do is we use these little O-rings, and make it a lot easier, you know, to rig the bait and obviously to keep it from tearing your baits up. This is a light application. I'm throwing it because it's so light. I'm throwing it on a spinning reel here. I've got 12-pound braid to a 10-pound test fluorocarbon leader, and you know, when these fish get real finicky and real picky, this tends to produce some fish. So we're going to give it a shot. It's not the most exciting fishing. It can be very boring, but if they're biting, you can really catch some good fish. So I'm going to give the Fat Ace a shot here and see if we can't catch some of these suspended fish. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm letting this bait just fall slowly. It's Senko is referred to as a stick bait, and it's just very slow sinking bait. just kind of making its way towards the bottom. So if these fish are suspended, you know, in the middle of the water column, you're essentially just hanging that bait, you know, right in that strike zone for a longer period of time with that slow rate of fall, being that there's no weight on this bait. You know, with that fluorocarbon, it's a real real finesse type of application. So I'm fishing it on light tackle. You know, there's not much weight to it, so it's hard to cast on a bait caster style of rod. But you know, this, you can catch all size fish on this particular bait. And what I'll do is I'll let it sink a little bit, and then I'll just kind of raise my rod tip just a little bit. And I want to keep my line somewhat tight so I can gauge and feel those bites. You know, usually when the fish are like this, when they're being stubborn and they're real skittish, you know, you're not going to get that super hard, you know, bite. A lot of times it's going to be very subtle, or they're just going to come up to it and inhale it, and you're just going to feel kind of that mush, kind of like, you know, just dead weight. And what we're doing is just kind of bringing it up, letting it fall back down. We're just letting that Senko just kind of hang out in the middle of the water column. Just like, you know, it's just hanging out right in their face. You know, hey, here I am, come and get me. It's, you know, again, for these bass being opportunistic feeders, they really don't have to do much. You're just kind of slowly dropping that bait, you know, right in front of their face. When you're fishing this style of bait, you know, you don't want to muscle them. Obviously, we're fishing with light spinning tackle here. Make sure you've got your drag set to where it's not, you know, 100% cinched down. You want it to have a little bit of slip, especially if you've got a fluorocarbon leader on your bait, similar as to what I have. You know, you don't want to hammer it down when you set that hook. You want it to give a little bit, and you know, allow for that fish to pull drag, especially if you got a bigger fish. You know, you'll pop them off on this lighter tackle. So that's just something you want to take into consideration, think about. You know, this is not a you know, a power fishing technique by any means. These mine pits, you know, with this deeper water, you know, I feel like for Florida anyways, you know, these fish, I think, have the ability to live a little longer, you know, than say a shallow water lake, you know, that only gets 10 to 12 feet deep, because they've got somewhere to go and hang out, you know, in the summer when it gets really hot. So, you know, anytime you're fishing these big mine pits, it can be, I mean, you've got the chance of just catching a giant at any given time, because these fish are like damn dinosaurs. You know, you got lots of bait, you've got depth, just healthy and conducive to, you know, to breeding big bass. A little better than the first few, but we did lose a treble hook on that one. But, so they seem to be, I mean, we've caught them in this little stretch here for the last this little 100-yard stretch kind of right off the bank as we're ripping it through the hydrilla. So I'm gonna hit it a little more and see if we can't get something with some size. But before we do that, I'm gonna reset and get get another treble hook for this bait. Not a big one, but we'll take it. These fish seem to be relating to any kind of grass off the bottom. You'll see me kind of pull my rod tip back from time to time, and it's because I'm hung up on some of that grass. I'm just trying to rip it through there, and 9 times out of 10, like I mentioned earlier, they'll hit it as soon as it breaks free from that grass. It's almost like a reaction strike. A few fish we've caught on this rattle trap have come out of that sparse hydrilla, just kind of ripping it through there. We just need a couple big ones to bite now. We're just pushing our way up to this point where we got winds picked up quite a bit. So looks like there has been some activity with bait. Haven't seen anything busting the bait on the surface, so I don't think they're really fired up yet, but we've gotten a couple more bites now that the sun's up. So I think it's just a matter of time before it's dinner time again. You know, again, we're kind of at the mercy of the moon. You know, it's, what is it, 10:30 now, and it's settled now, but it was up. Moon was up high in the sky, still at 9 o'clock this morning. Thought I knew he was little. There's my other worm, he had it in his mouth. So down here in Florida, you can pretty much catch bass on a Texas rig worm year-round. Doesn't matter. Spring, summer, fall, it really doesn't matter. You can catch them any time of year. I'm just fishing a 10-inch zoom with a ribbon tail and like a crawfish color. I was fishing a black and blue color worm earlier, and you know, I wanted to give him something different. Typically, fall into winter is when bass will start to feed on crawfish. I mean, they'll feed on crawfish year-round, but more so this time of year. So that's kind of my thought process behind going to this crawfish color, and we'll see. Right here there's a ledge that comes out off here, and then up on this flat area there's some hydrilla. A few months back it was a lot more prominent. The hydrilla was, you know, the summer months it grows pretty rapidly, but you know, as fall and winter start to set in, it doesn't grow quite as well, and so it's died out a little bit, but there's still some there, and these fish, I believe, are in it. And what we're doing is basically just dragging this worm. I'm doing a swimming motion, so if you look at my rod here, we'll picture that as the bottom, and all I'm doing is swimming that worm up and down, and I'm letting the tail do the work for me. Because of that ribbon tail on it, it's pretty much moving the whole time. Anytime you're pulling it through water, that tail is just spinning. Little guy. Man, I don't know what's going on today, but if we were fishing for smallest bass, I might have something here. I don't even know how this guy. That, my friends, is a giant.
Will be.
Maybe one day. Give it a few years. So this is probably the closest thing to a pattern that we've been able to develop so far today. And there's no size to these fish yet, but you know, it's a little bit of a confidence booster for sure, because when you've casted several hundred times, you know, and you don't even get a bite, you're kind of like questioning yourself, all right, what am I doing here? So that's when we talked about earlier, you know, that's when you start looking at everything. Start looking at the colors you're using. Start looking at the size of your bait. Start looking at the presentation of your bait, okay? This morning, you know, I'd caught maybe half a dozen fish in a matter of 3 hours using a moving bait, crankbaits, rattle traps. And, you know, that just didn't seem to cut it. Now, I've caught them in here on that before. That's a better fish. Oh, he's swimming right at me. There he is. That's a better fish. Go ahead and dance for me. A little better fish, not a giant, but that's more along the lines of what we're looking for right there. And so like I was saying, let me get this trolling motor, get us locked in here. But as I was saying, you have to get out of the mindset of this is what's worked for me here in the past. This morning we tried what's worked in the past. We tried what would historically work this time of the year, and it just wasn't working for us. So switch it up, downsize, change the color, go from a moving bait to a more finesse style bait, and that's the result. So we're gonna keep pushing along and see if we can't get her big brother. Yep. Are we on?
Yeah.
So you'll notice, for those of you newer anglers, this is a crawfish. I'm going to go ahead and just rip this through because we're done with this worm. But this is normally a 10-inch worm. It's bitten down to about 7 inches now. It's mostly the ribbon tail. The body of it's gone for the most part, and the reason for that is basically I'm just biting the head off. So you can continue to use, you can catch 3, 4, 5, 6. I've caught as many as a dozen fish off one worm. If it doesn't get too tore up, you can continue to use it. So, and at the top usually gets tore up. You know, if you're looking at a traditional EWG style hook here like we're using, Gamakatsu, a lot of times up here where it's got that bend in the shaft is where it'll tear out of the head. And usually what I'll do is I'll bite off about a ½ inch of the head, and then I'll reinsert the hook and I'll go back at it. So I had bitten the head off of that worm 4 times, and it still worked. The biggest fish came off of the last time. So rigging this is very simple. I'll go right through the top, come down about a ¼ inch, push that hook point out, slide it up. As you're sliding up, I want you to go ahead and just twist it, and you're going to push it up as such. On this one, I'm fishing a small weight. This is a 3/16 ounce, because with the way these fish are acting real finicky, I want my bait to fall a little slower. I don't want to just sink straight to the bottom. And because there's some grass on the bottom here, I want to keep that weight close to the bait. Keep that weight close to the bait. So what I'll do is I'll use a bobber stop on there to keep that weight from sliding up and down my line. And basically what that does is, you know, if you're coming through a piece of grass, what you don't want to happen is for your weight to slide over grass or a piece of structure and for your bait to still be back here. Because a lot of times what will happen is that fish will have that bait in his mouth and you won't feel it, because all you're feeling is where your weight is. So you want to keep that weight snugged up to that bait. Once you've got it like that, go ahead and we'll pull down a little bit, come straight up, push that through. Once I push that hook through, like as such, I want to go ahead and reinsert it back into the worm so it's just under the surface. So when I set my hook, it doesn't have to come through the entire worm. It's just under the surface, but it's still weedless and it's still straight. All right. That fish, I believe, hit it on the fall. As that bait was coming down, I didn't see a tick of my line or a jump of my line or anything like that, but as soon as I went to go pick up, she was there. So that tells me that, you know, we're making the right choice right now by going with a lighter weight, giving it that slower fall. You know, a lot of times when they're acting finicky like this, or they're suspending, or, you know, they're just not really eating, you know, if you have a bait that's got a very slow fall rate, it'll a lot of times trigger that bite on the way down. And that's what just happened there. You hear me okay? So we're right off this little point here where all these cattails, you know, people to call them different things, cattails, reeds, buggy whips, but there's a little point that it comes out to here, and there's some hydrilla underneath, and seems to be a little group of fish congregated over here, just kind of hanging out. And again, we're just swimming this bait off the bottom, keeping that tail moving. Almost got your eye, bud. Well, when we were out here bright and early this morning, still rubbing our eyes from being sleepy, you know, I said that, you know, historically that when we've got a full moon situation, these fish will normally feed at night. And they'll gorge themselves, and then it's usually makes it tough for a morning bite. So we kind of came into this thinking that might be a possibility, and lo and behold, it held true. You know, we didn't really have a whole lot going on this morning, and the moon didn't actually settle till about 9:30, and me and the fish feed about every 3 to 4 hours. It's now 12:10 in the afternoon, and like a light switch, it just turned on. Still wanting a bigger one, but a lot more productive than we were being this morning. So just to kind of recap, you know, how we started this morning. You know, we thought, we knew that some of these fish are going to be suspending, so we started out doing some you know, some flutter spoons and some rattle traps and some crankbaits, and even tried a little bit of Carolina rigging on offshore structure, and it just they didn't seem to be cooperating. And it could have been that they just had gorged themselves last night with the full moon situation and just weren't eating. But you know, we slowed down our approach, slowed down our presentation, went with what I call the old faithful. Anybody that's fished in Florida will tell you that the Texas rig worm will never fail you. It's not the funnest technique, it's not the fastest technique, but it will work any time of the year. That wind is really picked up, you know, which can make it difficult at times in terms of, you know, your accuracy in your cast, and then also, you know, detecting your bites when you're fishing a slower, more finesse style bait like this. Well, we're not going to let it stop us. Right now we're kind of behind, we're tucked behind this point. You know, we're somewhat protected, not completely, but the wind isn't quite as bad as when we were on the other side. Every now and again you'll see me open my bail, my spool, and I'll let some line out. It's because a lot of parts in this lake, there's ledges and drop-offs to where, you know, it'll drop 15 feet like that. So if I'm watching my line and I'm swimming my bait off the bottom and I see my line continuing to sink, these are one or two things that are happening there. Either a fish has hit that bait and is running with it, or you're coming off the side of one of those ledges and you want to go ahead and feed it some more line so it can get to the bottom. Because a lot of times these fish they'll hang out right along the bottom of those ledges. So if you see me doing that, that's the reason why. You know, when fishing a bait like this, you want to you want to constantly maintain contact with the bottom, unless you're fishing like a speed worm or something like that, where it's just a constant retrieve. If you're swimming it like I am, you want to maintain contact with the bottom. So for those of you who are not really familiar with, fishing a Texas rig worm, I should say, it's probably one of the easiest baits to fish. There's really not a whole lot to it. You just, you can cast it out and let it sit and just slowly retrieve it, just dragging along the bottom. The way I'm presenting it right now is I'm basically swimming it off the bottom. You'll see I cast it out, let my bait sink to the bottom. I'll raise my rod tip. Every time I raise my rod tip, that ribbon tail on that bait is spinning, spinning, spinning. It's creating vibration, flash. And so what I'll do is I'm swimming it off the bottom, raising my rod tip, then I'm letting it drop back down to the bottom and raising my rod tip again. And if you've got a light weight like I've got on, and you've got any kind of depth in the body of water that you're fishing, a lot of times they'll hit it on the fall. So you want to watch your line as it's sinking. If you're using braided line floats, and you can see your line on the top of the water. If you see it kind of twitch or jerk or anything like that as it's sinking, go ahead and just slightly raise your rod tip or reel up a little bit to get the slack out of that line, get some tension, and a lot of times you'll feel that fish has picked it up on its way down, and you go ahead and reel up the slack and set the hook at that point. Another thing you can do too, works better, I think, on these shallower diving crankbaits, but you can do a kind of a pause and twitch. You get it, once you crank it a little bit, get into the strike zone, and you can pop it, start retrieving it again, pop it, start retrieving it again. You can even give it multiple pops. Now, depending on the type of crankbait you've got on, like if you've got a floating crankbait like this one, even though this is a deep diver, if I cast this out, it's going to stay floating on the surface until I start my retrieve. If I stop retrieving, it's going to slowly rise. So if you watch, if this bait's underneath and I twitch, 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 it almost looks like an injured bait fish. So that's usually won't get hung up if you're further down in the water column, but a lot of times if they're not eating it when you're just doing that steady retrieval, if you just give a little twitch or just that stop and go style retrieve, it'll be just enough to get them to strike it.